Alright guys, welcome. So today we'll probably be getting finished up with chapter 6, so definitely moving into chapter 8 where we'll be kind of taking what we've learned about the bones and extrapolating on that and talking a little bit about joints. If you gave me your homework assignment or turned in extra credit last time we met, I have graded that, so your score should be updated in Blackboard. And then I also have that stuff up here for you if you want to come pick it up after class. And again, make sure you do, because I don't like having thousands of papers on my desk, so I usually just get rid of them after class if you don't pick them up. So you guys had asked about going to the bodies, and so I think we'll probably schedule a couple of field trips where you can do that. The Discovery Center, I think it's October 28th, which is a Sunday, is going to let us go, okay, and it's $10 instead of, which is about half off. Normally it's about $18 to go. Another instructor is going to be leading that field trip. Her name's Amanda Roberts. I'll schedule one for probably some point later than that, not on a Sunday, to ensure that we have different times and days scheduled. So we are working on that, and I'll send out the details to you guys in an email probably sometime later today if you're interested in attending that particular trip to the Discovery Center. And don't forget that I'm offering extra credit for that. I've heard that it's absolutely amazing, so definitely something you'll want to see.
Does the person have to be involved in the class to go?
No, I don't think so. So you just need to know who's going to go beforehand to get the group right. Anything else before we start? All right. So when we left off, we had finished up talking about the structure of bones, the anatomy, kind of reviewing some stuff that you probably talked about in your lab classes, adding to that a little bit some additional information here in lecture. And we had just kind of transitioned over into getting into more of bone physiology. So what we're going to do today is first of all start off talking again about how bones are formed. So the process by which bones are formed in the body is known as ossification. So if I say ossify, that means basically bone being formed. Ossification is this process of bone being formed. And then we'll get into a little bit some of the requirements for bones, so what keeps them healthy, how do bones heal, and that'll probably be our discussion for today, so that'll take up our time for today. So you guys may remember that when we left off, we had talked a little bit about this slide, and I had introduced to you the idea that ossification, or the process by which bone is formed, is going to start about 8 to 9 weeks in utero, and that's actually when we go from calling this developing baby an embryo to a fetus, okay, is when we start to see bone forming, which again is around the 8th to 9th week of fetal development. And we also talked about this idea that this process starts at about 2 months of fetal development, and then it continues all the way through birth, through infancy, through childhood, up until we're about 25 years old. And that's when the skeleton is finally mature and all the bones have ossified and everything that's supposed to be together is ossified together. We talked about also the fact that there's a couple of different ways that ossification can occur. So when we're talking about the skull bones specifically and the clavicles, this happens through a process known as intramembranous ossification, and you can see that process starting on this slide here with this fetus, again at about 8 weeks or so. Prior to 8 weeks development, what we would have seen in the area of the cranium is just a fibrous kind of tough membrane. And now you can see, picking up in red on the scan, that we've got actual solid bone that's starting to harden in that membrane. And of course that process isn't going to be complete even at birth, because you guys have worked in lab with the fetal skeleton, and you've seen that at birth there are those fontanelles present, which are areas where that membrane hasn't completely solidified, hasn't completely ossified. And that, of course, is important to the birth process. It's going to make the skull a lot more malleable, which makes it easier to pass through the birth canal. But also, during the first couple years of life, the brain grows very rapidly, and you don't want that skull hardened and fused together, because if it is, it's going to put pressure on the brain, and it's going to prevent the brain from being able to develop and grow like it should. So we see this starting in fetal development. The skull isn't going to be completely ossified until several years after birth, about 2 to 3 years. With the clavicle, same thing. So they're the bones as we talked about previously, that are last actually to complete their development at about 25 years of age. They're finally completely ossified and mature, like we would expect them to be in an adult skeleton. So what we're going to do with the next several slides is talk more in depth about this process of intramembranous ossification. How do you start out with this fibrous, tough membrane and convert that into bone? But before we do, I just wanted to remind you about the other type of ossification, which is the endochondral. Okay? And we can see endochondral ossification beginning in this scan as well. We've got all of the other bones of the body, okay, outside of the clavicle, the collarbones, and the skull, which primarily are formed through this other type of ossification, the endochondral, where we start out with a Highland cartilage model of the bone. That Highland cartilage model is broken down and it's replaced with mature bone, essentially. So once we get done talking about intramembranous ossification and kind of how it proceeds to convert this fibrous membrane into bone, then we're going to talk a little bit about endochondral ossification and how it proceeds to convert Highland cartilage actually into bone. So if you look at this picture here, again, we're going to be focusing for 4 or 5 slides on how intramembranous ossification occurs. This picture is meant to represent a fibrous membrane in the body. So we'll think of this, just because it occurs in the skull, we'll think of this during fetal development as that fibrous connective tissue membrane that encases, okay, the brain as it's developing. And we're going to talk about how this fibrous connective tissue membrane again transforms into bone through this process of intramembranous ossification. So the first thing that's going to happen, the first step that has to happen to take this fibrous membrane and convert it into bone, is we need to get formation of what's known as an ossification center. Okay? So you can see the ossification center forming right here in the middle of this fibrous membrane. And basically what happens to form this ossification center is you get some cells. Okay? These cells are associated with the fibrous membrane. You can see them here. They're these spindle-shaped cells that are represented in gray. They're known as mesenchymal cells. And what they are essentially are stem cells. They are capable of giving rise to any of the components of bone. So these mesenchymal cells actually become osteoblasts, or they're capable of becoming osteoblasts. They are capable of differentiating into or becoming osteoclasts. They actually form the periosteum of bone. So these mesenchymal cells are stem cells that are capable of becoming or forming any of the components of bone, essentially. And what happens to get this ossification center forming in the center of our fibrous membrane that we're going to start to harden into bone is some of these mesenchymal cells, and in particular it's the ones that are more centrally located within the fibrous membrane. They are going to cluster and they are going to differentiate, meaning that they're going to become something else. What they actually become are osteoblasts. So you can see that starting to occur here. Some of these, again, spindle-shaped stem cells, the mesenchymal cells, have gone through a change whereby they have now become these osteoblasts. And of course, we talked about what osteoblasts do the last time we met. There are bone builders. So they're the cells that start to then secrete bone. And that's what we're going to see happening in the next step of this process. So we've had some mesenchymal cells. They have differentiated. They've become something different, basically. They've now become osteoblasts. And what these osteoblasts are going to do as soon as they're formed is they're going to start to secrete osteoid. Okay, so osteoid is just bone matrix. It's basically that hardened part of bone, essentially, in which the living cells, the osteocytes, are actually suspended. So we're going to start to get some bone that's being secreted, that's being laid down by the osteoblasts in the middle of this fibrous membrane. What we're going to see happening is that bone matrix is going to be mineralized, meaning it's going to start to fill with calcium, it's going to start to fill with phosphorus, it's going to start to become hardened within a few days. So we've got this hardened bone that's starting to form in the center of this fibrous membrane, and that process basically is going to spread out. The other thing that I want to point out with this particular slide, and you can see this happening here, okay? We've got these osteoblasts. They're just secreting this osteoid or this bone matrix essentially all around them. And of course what that means as they're secreting this bone matrix all around them is they're actually trapping themselves within bone, okay? So they are actually secreting bone all around them, and you can see that here. And so now we've got these little cells, okay, that are trapped in these little small hollow cavities or lacuna essentially within the bone. And once these cells become trapped, once they've secreted the bone matrix all around them, they're now trapped in a little lacuna within that bone, they actually differentiate again. And they go from being osteoblasts, which secrete bone matrix, to actually becoming osteocytes, okay, which you'll remember from lab are the mature bone cells. And if you're familiar with the Osteon model that we have in class, in the lab classes, you know that basically what we've got with bone, okay, is osteoid, this bone matrix with little holes, and that's where we find the living cells of the bone. The osteocytes is within those little holes, and that's how they get there. Okay, they started out as osteoblasts, they secreted bone matrix all the way around them, they walled themselves off in this little cavity known as a lacuna, and once they did so, they differentiated again into now the osteocytes. So they're no longer bone secreting cells, but they are the mature bone cells essentially is what we've got going on. Oops. So we've got these osteoblasts, they're secreting bone, and what we're going to start to see happening now is this tissue is going to become vascularized. So we're going to have blood vessels moving in, bringing in nutrients, oxygen, all the things that we would need for a new tissue to be produced and to develop. And so what's going to happen with these osteoblasts is they're just going to continue putting down this bone matrix, but basically they're going to be putting it down around these blood vessels. And so what you're going to end up with is basically this random pattern of bone laid down around the blood vessels. And what that's going to do is form the spongy bone. So if you think back to what we talked about with spongy bone, what you've got essentially are these branching bars of bone, the trabeculae, that hold the whole network together, and in between that we have these open spaces. Well, what creates those open spaces is just bone being laid down around the blood vessels that are present. And so it's kind of this random network of these branching bars of bone being put down around the blood vessels themselves. The other thing that's going to happen at this particular stage in development is the periosteum is going to start to form. So you'll remember that the periosteum is that fibrous connective tissue membrane that surrounds the outside of the bone. It helps to protect the outside of the bone and encases it essentially. And we're going to see the periosteum starting to form at this particular time in development. What actually causes that periosteum, that fibrous membrane that surrounds the outside of the bone to form, is again the mesenchymal cells. So those are our stem cells that differentiated originally into osteoblasts. Here we're going to see them actually differentiating to form that periosteum on the outside of the bone. And what you'll notice we've got going on in this diagram here is those mesenchymal cells are starting to condense, okay, on the outer surface of the bone. And that condensation, okay, that thickening of the mesenchymal cells on the outside of this bone is what's actually going to form that protective membrane on the outside. It's actually going to form the periosteum. Kind of the last step in this process of intramembranous ossification, again, where we're forming the small bones, where we're forming the clavicles, is we're going to get what's known as a bone collar of compact bone forming on the outside. So this should look very similar to when we talked about the structure of short, flat, and irregular bones. I mentioned that what you've got is a bone sandwich essentially, so spongy bone through the middle and then compact bone on either end. If you think about the skull bones and the clavicles, okay, they fall into that category of being short, flat, or irregular, those particular bones. And so their final structure is going to be this bone sandwich structure, and that's where we're finally starting to see this come into place. But what's happening here is we're going to start to see the trabeculae, Okay, so those branching bars of bone that are just deep to the periosteum. So you can see the periosteum, that fibrous membrane that encases and encircles the bone on either side. The trabeculae just inside of that are going to start to thicken, and they are going to thicken into spongy bone that's solid. Okay, so the reason that I say it's spongy bone that's solid is because we aren't having osteons formed in here at this point. It's not yet compact bone. But what we're going to see eventually is the spongy bone is going to persist internally. The blood vessels that it was laid down around are going to become that red marrow, so that very vascular tissue that fills the inside of spongy bone and produces there inside of spongy bone red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets and all of the components of blood essentially. And we're going to see this bone color on the outside originally or eventually being replaced with mature compact bone where we've actually got the osteons that are present. Okay? But this is going to be our overall structure, and that's how we go from a fibrous membrane to something eventually that is essentially a bone sandwich, where we've got spongy bone through the center and we've got that compact bone on either side. And again, this is specifically the way that the collarbones and the skull bones are going to proceed through the ossification process. So again, the other type of ossification, or the other way to form bone, is to start out with a Highland cartilage model. And when we have bones forming through this particular process, what we refer to that as is endochondral. So endo meaning within, and chondral referring to the cartilage. So this is a process whereby bone is forming not in a membrane, but actually within a Highland cartilage model of a bone. So I want to do the same thing with endochondral ossification that we did with the intramembranous ossification, and look at step by step how this particular process proceeds to give us eventually mature bones from starting out basically with a Highland cartilage model. So if you look at this picture over here, this is kind of the first step in the process. You can see that we've got kind of a model. What you're seeing in blue is Highland cartilage. So kind of a Highland cartilage model of what is eventually going to become a long bone somewhere in the body. So it does very much resemble a long bone. And the first thing that happens to convert this Highland cartilage model of a bone into a mature long bone is we get a bone collar that forms around the diaphysis. So you can see that represented on this picture here. Here's the shaft or the diaphysis of this long bone. And it's hard to represent things that are three-dimensional, obviously two-dimensionally, but you can see that we're getting some bone, okay, that's forming kind of a collar. This would actually be all the way around it, 360 degrees around the diaphysis, but I think the artist has just shown it on the outside so that you can see that there is still Highland cartilage through the center of the shaft or through the center of the diaphysis. So we get this change that's going to occur, that the outside of just the shaft is starting to harden into bone. And that's the first place where we see bone being formed with this particular type of ossification. What's going to cause that change to occur is a change in nutrition. So we get a nutritional change that allows us to start forming some bone here around the diaphysis or around the shaft of the bone itself. What happens actually is blood vessels start to infiltrate the Highland cartilage. So one of the things that you may have talked about in your lab classes when you were doing the tissue section is that cartilage essentially is avascular. And that's why if you have damage to cartilage in the body, it doesn't replace itself, it doesn't heal, it doesn't repair itself, it's not capable of doing those things because it doesn't have a blood supply, which means it has no oxygen, it has no nutrients, the things that it would need to be able to replace and heal itself. So we get, in this case, some blood vessels starting to infiltrate into this area of the Highland cartilage. And of course, when blood vessels come in, they're bringing oxygen, they're bringing nutrients, all those things that would be necessary to start to produce bone.
So I think of Highland cartilage, and I think that it's the part that, I guess, where in is this happening is really what I'm asking.
This would be happening in the fetus.
Oh, in the fetus.
Yeah. All right, so we've got this fetus, and this fetus is really just cartilage, okay, at about 8 weeks development. And so I should have been more specific on that because it's not happening in you or me for sure. But we've got this fetus at about 8 weeks development, and at that point, really they're just a whole bunch of cartilage kind of models of bone. And now we're going to start to see this process occurring at that point where this hyaline cartilage model is starting to harden into mature endochondral bone, essentially, is what's happening here. So in the fetus, we've got these blood vessels coming into the area that causes a change in nutrition, and it causes the mesenchymal cells, so again, those stem cells that we saw with the intramembranous ossification, it causes those mesenchymal cells to differentiate into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are what now, of course, is secreting that bone collar around just the shaft of the bone, and it's 360 degrees around the shaft of the bone itself. Oops, why do I keep doing that? All right, so the next thing that we're going to see happening is we've got this collar of bone. It's 360 degrees around the shaft, and now the center of the shaft itself is going to start to calcify. So what I mean by that is the cells, okay, the hyaline cartilage cells in the middle of the shaft are starting to fill up with calcium. That is going to make those cells hard. It's also going to make it so that nutrients can't get into those cells because they are hard, essentially. So because nutrients can't get into these cells in the center that are starting to harden up, they're starting to fill with calcium, of course what's now going to happen is those cells are going to start to die off. Okay? So we had these hyaline cartilage cells, they calcified, now we've had this nutritional change, those cells are starting to die off through the center here because they become impenetrable to nutrients. As these cells start to die, of course what's going to happen is we're going to get a cavity that's forming here in the center of the shaft. And this is going to be kind of the first rudimentary part of the medullary cavity that's eventually going to be there through the center of the shaft, where we as adults are going to store yellow marrow. So we've had this nutritional change that first of all caused osteoblasts to develop and to start secreting bone. Then we had another nutritional change that caused the bone through the center of the diaphysis to start to die off. And now we're going to have a third nutritional change. What's going to happen, you can see this represented here, is we're going to get a structure which is known as the periosteal bud invading into the diaphysis, or invading into the shaft of the bone itself. So the periosteal bud is not just a blood vessel as it looks like here. The periosteal bud is kind of a conglomeration of a whole bunch of things. So we've got an artery that's bringing in oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich blood. It contains a vein, of course, so that we can have blood circulating in and out of the bone. It actually contains nerve fibers. But the other thing that's entering into the diaphysis with this periosteal bud are osteoblasts. Okay, our bone builders, so cells that are now going to start to secrete bone in this area, and also osteoclasts, which we'll remember are the cells that now break down bone. So in this particular step, we've got all 5 of those things that are entering into the shaft of the bone, and what that means is we are going to ossify the shaft, or we are going to convert the shaft into bone, and we're not going to worry about the epiphyses. We're not going to worry about the ends of the bone until a future step, essentially. So we've got this periosteal bud that has entered. With that periosteal bud, okay, we sent in osteoblasts. These osteoblasts are going to start secreting bone. We're going to get these cartilage cells, okay, in the epiphyses. They are going to start going through mitosis. So as these cartilage cells start going through mitosis, what's going to happen is we're going to get this area, okay, on both sides elongating out. Those hyaline cartilage cells are going to calcify, meaning again that they fill up with calcium, they become impenetrable to nutrients. When that happens, they die off, they erode, and the osteoblasts that we brought in with this periosteal bud are going to start to secrete mature bone in their place. What that means, if you think about it, is our bones are growing from here, okay, and from here. They're growing from the areas where we have hyaline cartilage. And as that hyaline cartilage is dividing, what that's doing is it's basically elongating the shaft of the bone, and then the hyaline cartilage is being replaced with mature bone, and that's going to allow the bone to actually lengthen out. The other thing that we sent in with this periosteal bud are osteoclasts, okay, which you'll remember are the cells that break down bone. And these osteoclasts are present because now they're going to start breaking down the bone in the diaphysis. So we already got some dying off of cells in the diaphysis. We already got kind of a rudimentary cavity forming in the diaphysis previously, but now we've got those formal cells for breaking down bone, the osteoclasts that are present, and they're going to start to erode and break down the bone on the inside of the shaft so that we get that formal, nicely shaped medullary cavity actually opening up in that particular area. So we, as I mentioned, are going to turn the shaft, turn the diaphysis into bone before we worry about the epiphyses. Kind of the last thing that happens is that after we've got this nice bone hardened shaft, we're going to do the same thing with the epiphyses. So you can see here in the last step, we've got a periosteal bud that enters now into the ends of the bones after we've already been working on the shaft. Of course, that periosteal bud is going to be bringing with it osteoblasts, nutrients, oxygen, all the things that would be necessary to actually be able to produce bone. So we're going to start to get bone, spongy bone specifically, secreted in the areas of the epiphyses. And what you're going to eventually end up with is a situation where a periosteal bud has invaded into the shaft and it's converted the shaft into bone. A separate periosteal bud has invaded into the epiphyses. It's converted the epiphyses into bone, and you end up with hyaline cartilage remnants left in different parts of the bone. So on the very outside of the bone, some of that hyaline cartilage remains, okay, even into adulthood. And that forms the articular cartilage that we talked about the last time we met. That's so very important to helping bones fit together better, cushioning bones that are against each other in joints, and also decreasing the friction as bones move against each other in joints. So that is actually a remnant, that hyaline cartilage that's left all the way from fetal development, and that portion of the bone just didn't harden during this ossification process. The other place that you get left with hyaline cartilage is in between the epiphyses and the diaphysis. So we also talked about that epiphyseal plate, or what's also known as the growth plate, and I mentioned that it's a band of hyaline cartilage, okay, that sits between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And what actually happens as we go from infancy to childhood to young adult, maybe into adulthood, is our bones lengthen from this band of hyaline cartilage, which is known as the growth plate. So these cells through our childhood and into young adulthood of the growth plate, they're hyaline cartilage cells. They continue to go through mitosis. They continue to be broken down by osteoclasts, okay, and replaced by osteoblasts. And of course, every time the cells in that layer are going through mitosis, basically what's happening is the bone is lengthening out, and that continues until we reach our adult stature. When we reach our adult stature, what happens is all of this hyaline cartilage gets broken down, replaced with bone, and then it's like the long bones that you guys have in lab that we have cut longitudinally, and you see just a little line, okay, the epiphyseal line. Where that growth plate used to be, the bones are now fused together. They're completely ossified. It's hardened bone from one side of the bone to the other. There's no longer this joint or this band of hyaline cartilage within the bone, and you see just that little line where the growth plate used to be, essentially. So we've looked at how bones are formed in membranes, okay, through intramembranous ossification. We've looked at how bones are formed using a hyaline cartilage model. Both of those processes, again, are happening in the fetus. That's where they're starting, and then they're completing, even as we move into adulthood, with our skeleton being basically completely mature at about 25 years of age.
So is the periosteal bud still present in adulthood?
It would be. So you've still got blood vessels that are infiltrating, and blood is extremely vascular, and that's why there's a lot of blood and there's a lot of pain when you have a broken bone. So yes, I mean the blood vessels that are in the bone that penetrate are a remnant of that.
So as children grow, they tend to go through spurts of growth. Is that just as it breaks down and changes over from Highland cartilage to bone, there's sort of a cycle of which there's growth and then reformation and then growth and reformation?
Right, so that is hormonally controlled. And so we're actually going to talk about some of the hormones that are controlling that and why you see growth spurts like at particular points in development a little bit later on. So that'll come up again, and hopefully I'll more fully answer your question at that point. If not, then ask me again.
And this might go along with his, how do medical professionals get diagnosis, such as growth issues or what's it called, precocious puberty from examining the growth rate? They can look at that and determine the person, a child is growing too fast.
Right, so it's hormonally controlled, and the easiest way to do it would just be to look at hormones in the body. I have a brother with a growth issue, so he just didn't produce enough growth hormone. And so, for example, at my wedding, he was 10, and my youngest sister was 5, and people kept saying, "Oh, there's twins, how cute!" And my brother was just absolutely furious because they were the same size, even though they were 5 years apart. So what they will do with children that have those growth issues is they will look at hormone levels in their body, and that's not a total determinant. They'll also look at growth rates over time, and they would want to see that they're not growing at the same rate as a child their age. And then if they were, and this is what happened to my brother, he just wasn't, they put them on synthetic growth hormone, which is a hormone that actually stimulates division of cartilage in the bones to help them catch back up. So usually when there is a growth issue, it's a problem with the pituitary, because that is the organ in the brain that produces growth hormone, and it can be underproduced like it was with my brother, or it can also be overproduced as well. And when it's overproduced, people end up, like 8 or 11 because they've got too much of that chemical that's telling those cells in the growth plate to divide and to lengthen out their bones essentially. So you can check it with hormone levels, but you would also look at growth rates over time and say, yeah, this person isn't growing at the normal rate that they should for somebody of their age.
So then if there's a hormone that they give them to make them grow, is there one that is there a hormone that can give them to make them?
So it's much easier when you have a hormone deficiency to just give you a synthetic hormone. Any hormone problem can be either you're not producing enough of it, which is usually decently easy to treat, we just give you the hormone, or you're producing too much of it. When you're producing too much of it, it is much more difficult to treat because you can't just clear the hormone from the body. Usually that's something that has to be treated surgically because usually there's a gland that's overactive, or you've got a tumor somewhere in the body that's actually producing that, and you have to remove that thing or treat that thing to prevent it from overproducing the hormone, because it's just hard to get rid of the hormones once they're there. So much harder to treat if it's an overproduction. Yeah.
So then what do they use when you need to stop a growth in one leg? How do they do that?
I don't know. I don't know. That would be something that you couldn't necessarily do hormonally because obviously the cells in one leg are responding differently. So I guess I don't even know what condition that you might be referring to.
Like when you have one kid that has one leg longer than the other, they stop the growth in the one to let it so that the legs can catch up with one another.
The only way that I could think of to do that would be to compress the leg that's growing too fast. When you compress legs or when you compress bones, that tends to inhibit growth to some extent. That's why they suggest for children that haven't gone through puberty that they should not be lifting weights because they're building those muscles and that's putting pressure on bones, which can actually stunt growth. It's the same thing with gymnasts. So gymnasts, because of the very intense exercise that they're doing very, very young, sometimes genetically or just people that are shorter, but it also tends to stunt their growth because of the compressive forces on the bones.
I was wondering, along with the hormone and everything like that aspect, is that part of like working?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to actually talk about that condition too a little bit later on. Anything else?
The synthetic growth we were talking about, is that the one that was going to HGH?
Is that the what? The human growth hormone, the HGH?
Yeah.
Is that what you asked? Yes. Yeah. So which sometimes gets abused. All right. Oops. I want to go back for a second because I wanted to lead into this and I realized I hadn't. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at with the slide, with the picture on the next slide, is we're going to have just this area, okay, very highly magnified. So we're looking at actual bone and we're looking at the actual cells that make up the growth plate itself. And I want to do that so you can have a little bit understanding or a little bit better understanding of how these hyaline cartilage cells at the growth plate actually go through this process where they're produced, okay, they calcify, they are dying off, broken down, and they're replaced basically with mature bone cells. So with that in mind, okay, here's that picture that I was referring to that again I said is basically a microscope slide from a bone. So I'm going to draw this up here for you so we can kind of keep the big picture in mind. Here's my representation of a bone, of a long bone specifically. Okay? And so what we're looking at as we look at this slide here is this area, this band of hyaline cartilage that sits between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, which is known as the growth plate and is the area from which the bone is actually growing or from which it's actually elongating. So if you look at this slide, okay, what we're seeing here again are the cells, the hyaline cartilage cells of the growth plate. And one of the things that I want you to know is within the growth plate we've actually got 4 different layers of cells. If you look at this part of the picture up here, this is actually bone, what you're seeing in pink. So what we're seeing is this area of the epiphysis as we're looking at this area represented in pink. Here we've got the first layer of cells in the growth plate. So these are actually resting cells. And what I mean by that, when I say that they're resting, is that these are cells that aren't actively going through mitosis. Okay, so they're not actively dividing at this point in time. One of the things that they do that's important is they help to bind, okay, the other cells of the growth plate to the epiphysis. Okay, so they kind of tend to help hold the hyaline cartilage and the bone together. Again, to give you kind of a big picture of this, the resting cells would be found in this most superior portion of the growth plate itself. And again, they're just kind of holding the growth plate to the epiphysis. They're not actually dividing, and that's what I mean when I say that they're resting. If we go just below the resting cells, down into this layer right here, okay, we now have cells that are undergoing mitosis. So they're still hyaline cartilage cells, they're still a part of the growth plate, but these are the cells that are actively dividing. And of course, as they're actively dividing and they're producing more cells like themselves, these newly produced cells are moving away from this area. That's elongating out the growth plate, and it's eventually going to lead to an elongation of the bone itself. So again, kind of sticking with the big picture, these cells that are actively going through mitosis, okay, would be found just below the resting cells, okay, in this area of the growth plate here. And so as they're dividing and they're producing more cells like themselves, they're going to eventually lead to an elongation of the bone. If you move down into this area here, you can see that the cells are physically starting to change. So they look very different. They're starting to become a little bit bigger in this area through here. They're also starting to calcify. So we've talked about what that means, that they're filling up with calcium. As they fill up with calcium, that's going to cause them to become harder. That's going to cut them off from nutrients. And of course, if you're completely cut off from nutrients and you're calcified, the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to start to die off. So again, kind of keeping with the big picture here, as these cells move away from where they're originally produced, they start to calcify and enlarge, okay? And that's happening in that area of the growth plate there. As these cells enlarge, they calcify, they cut themselves off from their nutrients. the cells, of course, are going to die off. So if you look at this area through here, we've got Highland cartilage cells that were originally produced up in here, moved away from the site where they were produced, enlarged, calcified, and now again you can see a structural change that's happening to these cells as they're starting to die off. So we produced Highland cartilage, it calcified, it's dead. The last step in this bone forming process is we're going to have osteoclasts coming in, destroying these dead cells, and osteoblasts replacing them with living bone cell, replacing them with bone matrix essentially. Okay, so these cells are dying off and they're being replaced with mature bone cells in that lowest, most inferior portion of the growth plate. But again, the overall idea is as this process proceeds, we're going to lengthen out the diaphysis of the bone by first producing Highland cartilage, having that Highland cartilage die off, okay, and then replacing it with mature bone cells essentially.
So the resting cells aren't just not going through mitosis, they're just staying as Highland cartilage.
Yes. So what will eventually happen, and this is what happens as we become adults and we reach our adult stature, is these cells go through mitosis and this starts to harden up by the osteoclasts breaking down Highland cartilage and osteoblasts replacing it. Well, as these cells stop going through mitosis, and eventually it's going to be these cells all the way up here that are the ones that are going through mitosis. When that mitosis stops, okay, we start replacing all of this with bone. That Highland cartilage goes away, and now right here is where we're going to eventually have that line. Bone's going to be here. We're going to replace all of this all the way up to that line with bone, and you end up with just that epiphyseal line, that remnant left of where that growth plate used to be. So we have talked about how bones lengthen out, okay, from the growth plate as we increase in stature to our adult stature. Of course, if you think about bones, the other thing that needs to happen as we increase in size, as we increase in weight, is they need to widen out as well. Okay, we can't have a femur as adults that was the same size as our little teeny tiny newborn femur. It's going to have to get longer, but it's going to have to get wider as well to support our increased stature, our increased weight as adults. So the last thing that I want to mention with regards to bone growth is what is known as appositional growth. Appositional growth essentially is bone thickening. It's an increase in diameter of a bone to allow for it to be able to support a larger weight or higher compressive forces. If you look at this picture here, if you could imagine taking the bone, cutting it like this, and then looking down in on that bone. Okay, hopefully you can imagine that this would be something that you would see. Here's our compact bone through the shaft. This is our medullary cavity. We've talked about how the medullary cavity is lined with a membrane known as the endosteum, how the outside of the bone, how the outside of the shaft is lined with a membrane which is known as the periosteum. So that's the basic view that I'm trying to give you with this picture. Of course, what happens in appositional growth is we're going to take a bone with a smaller diameter, we're going to give it a larger diameter so it's a stronger, thicker bone essentially. And the way that that happens is osteoblasts secrete bone matrix under the periosteum, so that's going to increase the diameter of the bone on the outside, but at the same time we're going to see osteoclasts removing bone under the endosteum, so that we're getting bone secreted on the outside, bones actually being degraded on the inside, which is opening up that medullary cavity. But those two things together are going to lead to a situation where the bone then is able to increase in diameter. That's going to make it stronger and allow it to be able to, again, withstand more forces and be a stronger bone essentially.
Without substantial weight addition, right?
Pardon?
But without any substantial addition of weight because the cavity is getting bigger. Is that why there's sort of a cavity in there to keep the weight of the bone down?
So it definitely is going to get heavier, But the cavity is there to limit the weight as much as possible. So it is going to get heavier because we need it to be stronger, but the medullary cavity is going to get larger as well, so that we're proportionately speaking, percentage-wise speaking, keeping things the same, if that makes sense, as far as size of the bone and what proportion of it is compact bone as compared to what proportion of it's the medullary cavity. All right. So we're going to change gears a little bit now and talk again about something that I mentioned and talked about briefly the last time that we met, and that is a process which is known as bone remodeling. So the last time we met, I was saying that the bones that we have now are not the same bones that we had 10 years ago. All of the calcium has been recycled out of those bones. All of the phosphorus has been recycled out of those bones. You've got completely new osteocytes, totally new different osteocytes from what you actually had 10 years ago. Because of this process where bone is constantly being deposited by osteoblasts, and at the same time the osteoblasts are communicating with osteoclasts and saying, we put down, this many milligrams of bone today, so you guys need to resorb this many milligrams of bone today to keep, the skeleton the same over time, so that the weight of the skeleton is not increasing, the weight of the skeleton is not decreasing, as long as you're not having a nutritional change or an exercise change or anything like that, which could drive it one way or the other. So I mentioned that why that's the case, I have no idea. Why can't we just build bone as adults and just let it be? But that's not how it is. These guys are constantly putting up bone and they're constantly taking down bone, so that about every 10 years they have completely recycled your entire skeleton. Just as kind of evidence of this, I've got a couple of pictures of skulls here. This is a skull from a 24-year-old, and you guys have worked in lab and you've learned the sutures and talked about how bones are not completely fused at birth, that happens a few years after birth, and where those bones of the skull come together, we get these suture lines, Because bone is constantly being built and constantly being broken down, as the body ages, those suture lines start to go away, because they're being replaced. The bones in the suture lines are being resorbed and they're being replaced by other bone tissue, essentially. So if you look at a skull of a 70-year-old, you'll notice that those suture lines are almost completely gone because they don't have the same bone, they don't have the same calcium, the same phosphorus that they had when they were 24. All of that has been replaced. And as it's been replaced, we're starting to see those suture lines disappearing. So it can be very, very easy to age skeletons based on these types of changes that you would see because of the fact that bone is constantly being remodeled. So I mentioned previously that you're going to see, as an adult, the density, your bone mass generally not changing, as long as you don't start doing more weight-bearing exercises, because that puts physical force on the bones, and that would cause bones to increase in size and increase in mass. As long as you don't become a total couch potato and stop putting any forces on the bones, because when you do that, they start to atrophy for some reasons we'll talk about a little bit later on. And as long as you're getting proper nutrition, and calcium and vitamin D being kind of key to that. If you are not getting enough calcium in your body, what will happen is your body will take it from the bones, because the bones are a calcium reservoir. There's a lot of calcium that's present there. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, calcium is needed for muscle contraction, and it is needed for nerves to signal. And it is far more important to the working of the body that the heart can contract and pump your blood. The heart being a muscle, it needs calcium to do that. And that the brain and the spinal cord can communicate with all the other areas of the body and kind of control and regulate what's going on. So if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, or you're not getting enough vitamin D, which helps you to absorb calcium, your bones are going to take a hit. They're going to take one for the team to save the brain and spinal cord and to save the heart. And of course, if that's the case, what you're going to see happening is osteoclasts continuously breaking down your bones, leaching that calcium to the body so that the brain and spinal cord and the heart have what they need to be able to function. And if that was the case, that you're not getting proper nutrition, you might see a decrease in bone mass over time. At the same time, if you change your exercise levels, if you change how much pressure, how much force you're putting on bones, that could lead to a net increase in bone mass over time or a net decrease in bone mass over time. So what I want to talk about next are a couple of things, okay, that can determine whether over time you're building bone mass or decreasing bone mass. The hormonal mechanism is there to regulate calcium levels in the blood and ensure always, okay, that the heart, the brain, the spinal cord have what they need to be able to function. The mechanical stress mechanism is there to ensure that bones are strong enough for the forces that are placed on them so that they don't break. So I first want to talk about what happens with this hormonal mechanism and a situation where you could see a net decrease in bone over time and a situation where you could potentially see a net increase in bone over time. If you look at this picture here, okay, what this is trying to represent for us, at least this part of the diagram here, is a situation where maybe you're not eating enough calcium, maybe you're not getting enough vitamin D in the diet, and so because of one or the other of those things, your blood calcium levels are too low, okay? They're starting to become abnormally low, so that if you don't do something about that, the heart's going to take a hit, it's not going to be able to contract. The brain, the spinal cord aren't going to be able to generate the electrical signals that they need to communicate with the rest of the body. There's an organ, roughly a butterfly-shaped organ, okay, that you guys learned in lab. It sits right about here in the neck, so it's pretty easy to palpate, kind of soft and spongy there in the neck. On the back side of this organ, which is known as the thyroid, there are 4 raised nodules, and that forms another organ which is known as the parathyroid gland. When calcium levels start to become too low, the parathyroid gland releases a hormone which is known as parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone is released when blood calcium levels start to become too low. What parathyroid hormone does when it gets into the body is it stimulates osteoclasts, and it causes osteoclasts to start to break down bone at a higher rate than normal. And of course, the problem with that is your bones are taking a hit and you're losing bone mass, you're losing bone density, your bones are becoming weaker. It's more likely that you're going to have broken bones and osteoporosis and all of those types of things. But the benefit of stimulating those osteoclasts is when they break down bone, the calcium, that hard part of bone, is being released to the blood. And so what that can do then is bring blood calcium levels up into a range where now the heart once again has what it needs, the brain, the spinal cord once again has what it needs at the expense of the bones, because unfortunately heart, spinal cord, brain are more important than bones, right? The other hormone that's involved with this is a hormone which is known as calcitonin. Calcitonin is released when blood calcium levels start to get too high. So if they're too high, that's a problem as well. That can start to cause problems with muscle contraction. It can start to cause problems with the way that the brain and the spinal cord work as well. So if we follow this pathway here, okay, again, it's the thyroid gland, so that gland that sits right here in the neck that's involved in this particular pathway. If calcium levels start to get too high in the body, and by the way, this is not very common because your body will limit how much calcium it can absorb. You're only able to absorb about 500 milligrams at a time. So if you've heard that you need to have 3 calcium-rich foods a day and you have all of them at breakfast, you're not going to absorb all of the calcium from those foods. You need to have 3 calcium-rich foods a day at 3 different times of the day to ensure that you're absorbing all of the calcium from the foods. So this is not so much of a problem because your body really limits how much calcium it can absorb in a particular amount of time. But if blood calcium levels were to get a little bit higher than normal, the thyroid gland would release this hormone, which is known as calcitonin. What calcitonin does is it stimulates osteoblasts. And it causes those osteoblasts to take that excess calcium and start incorporating it into the bones. And that helps to build bone mass and to build bone density. One of the things about this particular hormone is most of us as adults stop producing it, or we start to produce it in decreasing amounts. And that is thought to be one of the reasons, okay, not the entire story, but one of the reasons that osteoporosis, where you've got really decreased bone mass, bone density, becomes a problem for older adults because they're not producing so much of this hormone that helps them to take calcium out of the blood and actually incorporate it into the bones. So that's the hormonal mechanism, and again, it's kind of based on diet factors and how much calcium is in the blood. And if there's not enough calcium in the blood, and that's a chronic situation, you're going to see a net decrease in bone density and bone mass over time. If there's sufficient calcium in the blood, then at least as children, you're going to see that bone mass, bone density increasing up into and through middle adulthood, where calcitonin stops being produced, and then you're not going to have as good of a mechanism for taking calcium out of the blood and getting it into the bones. The other mechanism that I mentioned is the mechanism that's based on stress or forces that are applied to the bones. And here's where I want to start talking a little bit about something that I've mentioned previously, and that is the fact that bones are extremely strong. Okay? They're actually about 5 times as strong as steel. They're extremely strong, but they're extremely lightweight. And one of the ways that we allow this to happen in the bones, or that this occurs, is that all of our long bones are actually hollow through the center of the bone itself. So this idea, the structure of bones, relies on what's known as Wolff's Law. And Wolff's Law says essentially this: bone grows where stressors are placed on it, and it weakens, okay, where stressors aren't acting. So if you are somebody who's really active, you do a lot of weight-bearing activities, your bones are going to increase in size and strength and mass and density because of that. If you're a couch potato, your bones are going to take a hit because you're not stressing the bones, and that's going to cause them to atrophy over time. If you look at this picture here, hopefully this bone looks familiar to you. This is the femur, so we've got the head of the femur here, trochanters, we've got the shaft of the femur through here. But this particular picture does a good job of representing why long bones can be hollow through the middle and still just as strong as they would be, okay, if they were solid all the way through, but that allows them to be much more lightweight. If you think about the femur, the load of our bodies, okay, the force of our body is placed on the head right here. So that's where the weight's being placed. And so we end up with a situation in the bone that's represented by these arrows. We have compressive forces on the medial part of the bone. We have stretching forces, okay, both forces placed on the bone, on the lateral part of the bone, and right here through the center of the bone, the compressive forces are canceled out by the stretching forces. So there's basically no force through the center. Because of that, we can have that hollow opening. It doesn't decrease the strength of the bone whatsoever. There's actually no force on the bone through here, but it allows us to decrease the weight of the bone so that we can get away with the skeleton that is very, very lightweight, but extremely strong and capable of actually being able to support our bodies. So kind of the big idea that I want you to take away from Wolff's Law and what we've talked about with this particular slide is simply that your bones are going to be strongest where they are being stressed. And that is why weightlifting is so good for bones, because as you're weightlifting, your muscles are pulling on the bones, and that physical stress on the bones is going to cause the bones to grow. It causes the bones to respond to that, to thicken, to grow, to increase in size, to increase in mass, and to increase in density as well.
Do they worry about this when with like space exploration?
Absolutely.
Because I know it affects the muscles quite a bit quicker, but
absolutely. So the question was, do they worry about this with space exploration? And absolutely they do. And I've heard that astronauts in space have to exercise something like 3 hours a day, much more than you would have to on Earth, because they don't have those forces being placed on their bones because there's no gravity. And so they have to exercise extensively, and they still come back with atrophied muscles and atrophied bones because of this particular situation, which is why, you know, we talk about going to Mars and other places, and it's like, that would be fantastic, but I'd hate to see the physical toll that's going to take on somebody with their muscles and bones, unless we find, you know, something better to help them over time to keep their bone density and their muscle mass not atrophying quite so much.
The Japanese actually just came out with something that they want to implement on the space station. This is a large centrifuge that somebody sits down in, or lays down in, I guess you'd say, and it spins likewise, so all the compression is down at your feet. You know, it makes an artificial gravity. Basically.
Right. Okay. That sounds like it might make me really sick. But I'm just thinking about that thing that they always have at the fair. That does the same thing. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Yeah.
Does Wolf's Law apply to, like, I have a 3-year-old, for instance, who continuously hits his head in the same spot when he falls down, and he's actually calcified his skull? Is that as well?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture of something very similar a little bit later on. So any force, even if it's like you're sitting here doing this all the time, would do it, which is actually what Muay Thai fighters do. So I had a student a while back who was a Muay Thai fighter, and he was telling me that it was from Thailand, I don't know, somewhere in Southeast Asia where that particular form of fighting was developed, that they would actually break the legs of children. So I hope they're not still doing this, but break the legs of children historically, and then they would sit there and pound on their broken legs, knowing that that force placed on the bone was going to cause those bones to grow back so much larger and stronger. And then when you're kicking, okay, in Muay Thai fighting with those shins that have been through that process, you're going to be able to kick a lot harder and with a lot more force without breaking your bone because of it. So absolutely.
So
Yeah.
we should get our show. Yes, we should.
Women have like 30 their max bone density, and I think men are like 40. Does that mean like even if you're weightlifting after you're 30, that's as big as your bone will ever be?
So it's about 35 in women, it's about 45 in men. And so the suggestion that doctors would make is that you want to build your bone mass as much as possible before 35, but even after 35, the weightlifting that you do is going to counteract the hormonal changes that are occurring so that you're not losing bone density at the same rate that a woman who's not exercising would. So for me personally, like weightlifting is absolutely the best exercise that women can do for so many reasons, but also because they are predisposed to osteoporosis for hormonal reasons, and at an earlier age than men. And osteoporosis a lot of times is thought of as a woman's disease because it starts in women about 10 years earlier. Women have a longer life expectancy than men. If men started at the same age that women did, they would end up osteoporotic as well. But a lot of them die earlier, so you don't see it as much because they don't reach that age where it really starts to become a problem. So it is absolutely a problem in men. It just starts about 10 years later. All right, which is what I wanted to talk about with this particular slide. So we talked about this idea of bone remodeling, and normally if your nutritional state is staying the same, if you're exercising, that's all staying the same, your activity level, then normally we've got this communication that's going on between the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, where every day the osteoblasts put up this much bone and they say, hey, osteoclast, you guys have to take down this much bone to keep everything steady and stable over time. Well, there are certainly situations where that resorption can outpace deposition, where osteoclasts start working at a faster rate than the osteoblasts are working. And of course, when that happens, what can be the eventual situation that develops is osteoporosis. So we've seen this slide before. This is normal, healthy, spongy bone. We've got those branching barns of bone, the trabeculae, that kind of surround that very vascular red marrow. Here's spongy bone from somebody with osteoporosis, and you can see how much that bone has been degraded, how slender the trabeculae are, how delicate, fragile looking they are. And a lot of times people with osteoporosis will start to get spontaneous fractures, meaning that they didn't fall on a bone to hurt it, but they were just up walking along, okay? And because their bone was so osteoporotic, it just snapped. So they broke a hip and fell on the ground, not that they fell on the ground and that caused them actually to break a hip. So there's a few things that would cause this outpacing of osteoclasts to occur. Obviously, probably first on the list for people that are young and healthy is diet. Because if you're not getting enough calcium, your osteoclasts are taking it out of your bones to feed your heart, to feed your brains and your spinal cord. Maybe you're getting enough calcium, but you can't absorb calcium well without vitamin D. So if you're not getting enough vitamin D, that can counteract what you're doing with eating calcium-rich foods, and you can still become calcium deficient and end up with a situation then where osteoclasts are taking that calcium out of the bone all the time. Did you guys talk with Corey about the best way to get vitamin D? So there are not a lot of foods that are naturally high in vitamin D. Vitamin D is added to milk, it's added to breads and things like that to try and increase the amount of vitamin D that we get nutritionally. But historically, talking in evolutionary terms, the best way that we as humans would get vitamin D was from sun exposure. So vitamin D is produced by the skin, and it's produced by the skin when you have exposure to UV rays. Okay? So a lot of us, as we are getting increasingly sun conscious and worried about sun exposure and those types of things, we're starting to see people becoming more vitamin D deficient. And they have correlated vitamin D very recently with a lot of inflammatory diseases. So asthma, for example, asthmatics are always vitamin D deficient. They very, 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 very seldomly do you have somebody who's not vitamin D deficient who has asthma. It has been correlated with arthritic conditions where you've got inflammation from that. Vitamin D deficiencies have been correlated with problems in mental health, and brain development, and all of those types of things. So we're seeing, okay, these rates of vitamin D deficiency going up, and we're also seeing these rates of conditions that are related to vitamin D deficiency going up as well, because we're just totally avoiding the sun, and that's actually not what our bodies were meant to do, was totally avoid the sun, because that is the best way for us to get vitamin D, is by that reaction that happens in the skin when we're exposed to UV rays. Okay, so that doesn't mean go to the tanning bed, but that means, 10, 15 minutes of sun exposure a day without sunscreen on. The other problem that we face, because we live in a northern latitude, is during the winter months, usually there's not high enough sun intensity for us to actually get the UV rays necessary to get vitamin D. So a lot of us, even if we're not vitamin D deficient in the summer, start to become vitamin D deficient in the winter. So I take vitamin D 3 times a day. And I give it to my son because he's asthmatic as well. I supplement that a lot because it's just been correlated very recently with so many conditions, and so many of us are vitamin D deficient. And it really becomes a problem in the winter in a northern latitude, which is what we are. So I talked about calcium. I went off on vitamin D. And I was also going to say, okay, that this process of osteoclasts outplacing osteoblasts is also hormonally related. Okay, and that's why in women at about age 35, when sex hormone levels start to drop off just a little bit, we start to see osteoclasts naturally outpacing osteoblasts. Okay, and that's what's going to predispose women to osteoporosis. For men, same thing. When testosterone levels start to drop off a little bit at age 45, that's going to influence osteoclasts, are going to start to naturally outpace osteoblasts, and men are going to start to lose bone density and bone mass around that age. So the last thing that I want to look at, we've got about 5 minutes left. Last thing that I want to talk about just briefly are some requirements for healthy bones. And based on what we've talked about with Wolff's Law, I would hope that you'd be able to extrapolate from that one of the things that's really important is just physical stress being put on bones. So they have done all sorts of studies on athletes, and what they've found is it's weightlifters that have the highest bone density. Swimmers, out of all athletes, have the lowest bone density. And if you think about swimming, it's a great movement activity, it's a great cardiovascular activity, but you're floating in water. So there's no stress on your bones. It's not a good bone density increasing activity. So weightlifters have the highest because that is absolutely a bone stressing activity, down to swimmers, with all other types of athletes kind of in between. We talked a little bit about Muay Thai fighters and some of the things that they did, at least historically, to increase the size, the mass, the density of their shin bones. This is actually a bone that was taken from an archaeological dig in Virginia and was at the Smithsonian a few years back. It's about 400 years old. Hopefully you recognize it. This obviously is a femur. What you'll notice is right here down about mid-thigh, we've got this huge thickening of the bone. And based on that, the people who did this archaeological dig were able to recognize that this was a bone that came from somebody who was a cobbler, that came from somebody who made shoes. And the reason for this is cobblers, when they used to work and make shoes, would have their leg up like this. They would put the shoe on their leg, and then they would sit there and pound the sole on. So they had this constant pounding on their femur that would occur. And just from that, again, a physical stress on the bone, it caused an increase in the size and the strength of that bone that even 400 years later could be detected, and we would know, okay, what the profession of this person had done based on the fact that they had that growth. And that's pretty common to see, and it's actually known as cobbler's femur because you only really see it in cobblers or people that were putting a lot of stress on the femur. Here's a couple of other things. Some nutritional requirements. So obviously a balanced diet is necessary for health in general, and that's true for health of the skeletal system as well. But there are a couple of vitamins in particular that I want to mention that are especially important for the skeleton. And the first of these is vitamin D, and I talked about vitamin D already just a little bit and mentioned that it is necessary for calcium to be absorbed properly. You can eat calcium all day, and if you're vitamin D deficient, you're not going to be absorbing the calcium that you actually need from the foods that you eat. Of course, it's calcium that forms the hard part of bones. So if you're vitamin D deficient and you're not getting enough calcium, bones will still form, but they will be softer than normal because they don't contain the calcium that they need. When this happens in children, it leads to a condition which is known as rickets. So you can see rickets in this little boy here. He didn't get enough vitamin D in his development. That prevented him from being able to absorb calcium properly. That made his bones softer than normal, and so as he put weight on those bones, as he stood upright, that actually caused the bones to bend and to bow because they are just softer than normal. Here's another bone. This was actually part of a skull bone that was taken from an infant. It was thought that this infant was about 5 months old, same archaeological dig that our cobbler's femur came from. And what the scientists decided with this particular infant was that they had been swaddled to death. Okay, so swaddling was something that especially way back was done, and it meant basically that you covered an infant from head to toe very tightly with a blanket, and that would make them feel good, right? Because that's how the womb was. They were squished and couldn't really move and were warm and all of those types of things. So it worked to kind of keep children warm, okay, during cold winter months, and to help them feel secure as well. But what the archaeologists decided was this child had rickets, okay, and you can see that. This is a skull bone. There's parts of it where it's not even completely formed, and this child had died from rickets because it was a child that was born in the fall. It had been swaddled all winter, and the child died in the spring. And they knew that because of the pollen grains that they found buried with this child when they did this particular archaeological dig. So we've got about 3 minutes left. I want you to talk over with your neighbor. Why would swaddling a child through the entire winter lead to rickets, okay, which would lead to improper bone formation, and for this child led to death? So before you guys go, so you've talked this over. Go ahead and take out a piece of paper, write your name on it, put your answers, answer or answers. And remind me if I forget to talk about the reasons why when we come back next week.